My daughter called me at 6:47 in the morning, and I knew before I even picked up that something was wrong. She never called that early, not unless something had broken, a pipe, a car, a heart. I was in Savannah visiting my old friend from the army, a man I've known for 40 years, sitting on his back porch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, and when I saw her name on the screen, my stomach dropped the same way it did the night her mother passed. Just that same quiet dread. "Daddy," she said, and then she stopped. That one word told me everything. Let me back up, because you need to understand how we got here. My daughter, I'll call her my baby girl, because that's what she'll always be to me, even at 34 years old. She married a man named Brendan about 3 years ago. I want to be fair when I talk about him, because I've spent a lot of time trying to be fair. He wasn't a monster when she brought him home. He was charming, polished. He had good manners at the dinner table, and he always stood up when I walked into the room. I noticed that. Old-fashioned thing to do, but I noticed it. What I also noticed, and what I kept to myself for longer than I probably should have, was the way his eyes moved around my house the first time he visited. Not like a man looking at a home, like a man doing inventory. My wife would have caught it before I did. She had a gift for reading people that I never quite developed. But my wife had been gone 4 years by then, and I was doing my best to see clearly on my own. My daughter was in love. And love, as I've learned over 67 years on this earth, has a way of making people temporarily blind to things that are sitting right in front of them. I didn't say anything at first. What was I going to say? I had no proof, just a feeling. Just a pair of eyes that lingered a little too long on the built-in bookshelves my father made by hand, on the original artwork my wife collected over 30 years, on the backyard that backs up to the creek. Just a man who asked, very casually, very early in the relationship, whether I'd ever considered downsizing. I was 65 years old. I wasn't going anywhere. But I smiled and said I was comfortable where I was, and I watched him file that answer away somewhere behind those careful eyes. They got engaged 8 months after they met. My daughter was happy in a way I hadn't seen her be in years, and I held on to that. I really did. I walked her down the aisle in a church in Charleston, and I danced with her at the reception, and I meant every word I said when I told Brendan to take care of her. I meant it like a prayer and like a warning at the same time. The wedding cost more than I want to say out loud. Brendan's family contributed almost nothing. I didn't make a scene about it. I wrote the check and I smiled and I danced and I let my daughter have her day. But I went home that night and I called my attorney. I'd already been thinking about it for months. After my wife passed, I'd done some estate planning. Basic things, a will, beneficiary designations, the usual. But watching Brendan at that wedding, watching the way he talked to the caterer about the venue, like he was already calculating its value, I knew I needed to do more. What I did next, I didn't tell anyone. Not my daughter, not my brother, not my oldest friend in Savannah. I just quietly, carefully restructured things, moved the house into a trust. Reorganized how certain accounts were titled, made sure that if anything ever happened to me, or if my daughter ever found herself in a situation where her marriage wasn't what she thought it was, the people I loved would be protected, and the people I didn't trust would find themselves with nothing to grab onto. My attorney asked me once, while we were going through the paperwork, whether I was worried about something specific. I told him I was just being careful. He nodded like he understood completely. The first 2 years of the marriage were fine on the surface. Brendan had a job in commercial real estate, appropriate, I always thought, given his instincts. And my daughter was working as a physical therapist at a practice she loved. They bought a townhouse in Mount Pleasant. They got a dog. They seemed, from the outside, like a normal young couple, building a life. But I'm a father. I see what's underneath the surface. I noticed that Brendan's interest in my finances had a way of surfacing at odd moments. He'd ask my daughter things. Not me directly, never me directly, and she'd relay them without realizing what she was carrying. Did Dad ever mention what he paid for the house on Edisto? Does he have a financial advisor, or does he just manage things himself? Has he thought about what happens to everything when he's gone? My daughter thought he was just being responsible, planning ahead, thinking about family. I thought he was casing the place. And then, about 8 months ago, things started to shift. It started small. Brendan began showing up to family dinners with what I can only describe as an agenda. He'd bring up real estate values in my neighborhood, unprompted. He'd reference an article he'd read about older homeowners liquidating assets for retirement income. Once, and this is the one that stuck with me, he suggested, very gently, very reasonably, that since my house was really more space than one person needs, it might make sense for me to move into something smaller and let him and my daughter take over the property to maintain it. He called it keeping it in the family. I called it something else in my head, but I kept my face neutral and said I'd think about it. My daughter looked at me with this expression, part hope, part apology, and I realized she'd been coached for this conversation. Maybe not in an obvious way. Maybe Brendan had just been patient, planting seeds over months, and this was the harvest. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no, I said I'd think about it. That night I called my attorney and told him what had happened. "You're still protected," he said. "Everything is still exactly where you put it." That was what I needed to hear. The situation accelerated about 4 months ago, when Brendan apparently decided that patience wasn't working fast enough. He began asking my daughter pointed questions about a safety deposit box I keep at my bank downtown. I had mentioned it once, years ago, casually, the way you mention these things, that I kept certain important documents there. Original deeds, my wife's jewelry, some letters and photographs that couldn't be replaced. That offhand remark had apparently lodged itself in Brendan's mind like a splinter. He started asking my daughter about it with more frequency. What was in it? Whether it was included in my estate documents, whether she had a key, whether she'd ever ask me about it directly. My daughter, to her credit, had always deflected. "That's Daddy's business," she'd say. But I could tell from the way she described these conversations to me. And she did tell me, eventually, because she's my daughter, and she tells me things, that the pressure was building. That Brendan was starting to frame it as a question of fairness, of her rightful inheritance, of him just trying to look out for her future. He was good at that. Taking his own agenda and dressing it up in love for my daughter. About 6 weeks ago, I told my daughter I was going to Savannah to visit my old friend. A long weekend, maybe a week. I'd been promising this trip for 2 years and it was time. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was that before I left, I visited my bank. I spoke with the branch manager, a woman I've known for 12 years. I told her I had concerns about unauthorized access attempts to my box. I gave her specific instructions, and then I updated the authorization documentation so that a secondary alert would go to my attorney and to my own phone anytime someone attempted to access that box. Then I drove to Savannah and sat on my friend's back porch. And 6 days later, at 6:47 in the morning, my daughter called me. "Daddy," she said, and then silence. "Baby girl," I said, "tell me what happened." She took a breath, a shaky one, and then she said, "Brendan tried to go to your bank yesterday morning. He told them he had power of attorney. He had a document, Daddy. He had a notarized document." I was quiet for a moment. "Was it valid?" I asked. She made a sound I hadn't heard from her since she was small and had fallen off her bicycle. Part sob, part disbelief. "No. The manager called your attorney before she even let him in the door. Your attorney said there was no such power of attorney. The document was." She stopped. "They're calling it fraudulent, Daddy." I set my coffee cup down on my friend's porch railing. I want to tell you I was shocked. I want to say that even with everything I'd observed, everything I'd felt in my gut for 3 years, I hadn't truly believed it would go this far. But the truth is quieter than that. The truth is that I had known, somewhere beneath all my hope, that I was wrong about him, that this was always where it was going. Some people show you who they are slowly, in small increments, and you keep giving them the benefit of the doubt because the alternative is too painful to accept. But they know who they are, and eventually they stop hiding it. Brendan hadn't found a clever way around my protections. He'd walked straight into a wall I'd built 3 years ago and stood there looking confused about why it didn't move. I told my daughter to stay where she was. I called my attorney, who had already spoken to the bank and was already in contact with the appropriate authorities. Then I drove home from Savannah. 4 hours, windows down, radio off, just me and my thoughts, and I went to my daughter's house. She met me at the door. She looked like she hadn't slept. Brendan wasn't there. I sat with her at her kitchen table and I told her everything. The trust, the restructured accounts, the alert system at the bank, the 3 years of quiet, careful work I'd been doing in the background while I smiled at family dinners and danced at her wedding and said nothing, because I loved her too much to be right and needed to protect her too much to stay silent forever. She cried for a long time. Not just about Brendan, about all of it. About the versions of her marriage she'd been defending in her head even when the cracks were showing. About the conversations she'd replayed and now understood differently. About the fact that her father had seen this coming and had loved her enough to prepare for it without ever making her feel like a fool for loving someone he didn't trust. That part was important to me. I never wanted her to feel like a fool. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked me. "When he first started asking questions, why didn't you warn me?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. "Because you had to see it yourself," I said. "If I'd told you what I suspected, you would have defended him. And maybe you would have been right. Maybe I was just a suspicious old man. But if you'd defended him and then stayed with him because you'd already argued his case to your father, that would have been worse. I needed you to come to your own understanding, baby girl. I just needed to make sure that while you were getting there, he couldn't take anything that wasn't his." She nodded slowly. She understood. We sat there for a while in her kitchen. The dog put his head in her lap. Outside, the afternoon light was doing something beautiful through the magnolia tree in her yard, that late gold October light that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than lived. She asked me what was in the safety best deposit box, what Brendan had been so determined to get to. I told her. Letters from her mother. Written during the year before she passed, when she knew she was running out of time. She'd written one for each milestone she wouldn't get to see. My daughter's next birthday, her wedding day, her first house, her first hard year, her first moment of real quiet joy after the grief. My wife had given them to me to keep. She'd said, "Give them to her when she needs them. You'll know when." I'd been waiting for the right moment for 4 years. I reached into my jacket pocket and put one on the table. The envelope was sealed. Her mother's handwriting on the front. Small and careful the way she always wrote. My daughter stared at it for a long time. "When did Mama write this?" she whispered. "She wrote them all in the last 6 months," I said. "She wanted you to have pieces of her for the hard times." She picked up the envelope and held it against her chest, and I had to look away for a minute, because there are some things a father doesn't need to watch up close. Brendan was served with papers 11 days later. My daughter had retained her own attorney by then, a woman I'd spoken to privately weeks before any of this came to a head, just to have a name ready. Another preparation, another wall built quietly in the background. The fraudulent power of attorney document is a separate legal matter now, one I'll let the proper authorities handle in their proper time. My concern was always my daughter, not the punishment of a man who turned out to be exactly who I suspected he was. She's doing better than I expected, honestly, partly because she's always been stronger than she gives herself credit for. And partly, I think, because she'd been carrying a version of this knowledge for a long time, without having a name for it. When the truth arrived in full, it was painful, but it wasn't a complete surprise. It was the confirmation of something she'd already been quietly grieving. She's back in our family home now, the guest room that was always kept ready for her. She brought the dog, and the dog has taken over my couch, and I don't mind one bit. Some mornings I come downstairs, and she's at the kitchen table with her coffee, and one of her mother's letters open in front of her, reading quietly. She doesn't always tell me what's in them. She doesn't have to. They were written for her, not for me. But once, a few weeks ago, she looked up from one and said, "Mama says you're going to drive her crazy worrying about me, and she's counting on me to tell you to relax." I laughed for the first time in a long while, a real laugh from somewhere deep. "Your mother," I said, "knew me better than I know myself." I've been thinking about what I want people to take from this. Not because I think my story is special. I know it isn't. There are fathers and mothers all over this country watching someone they love be slowly worked over by someone with a plan and feeling helpless because they can't say anything without starting a war. You're not helpless. You can't always protect the people you love from pain. I couldn't stop my daughter from marrying someone who didn't deserve her. I couldn't make her of finding out the hard way. I couldn't spare her the grief of finding out the hard way. Some lessons only arrive through living, but you can be prepared. You can be quiet and careful and strategic in the way you protect what you've built. You can talk to an attorney before you need one. You can set up a trust before anyone asks you about one. You can pay attention to what people's eyes do when they walk through your house, and you can make sure that whatever they're calculating, they come up empty. You can be ready. My wife used to say that hope is not a plan. She meant it kindly. She was the most hopeful woman I ever knew. But she understood that hope alone doesn't protect anyone. You have to do the work. You have to make the calls and sign the papers and think 3 steps ahead when everything in you would rather believe the best about people. I believed the best about Brendan for 3 years. I just didn't leave my daughter's future to that belief. That's all I did. I planned, and I waited, and I stayed ready. And when the moment came, when he walked into that bank with a document that was never real, there was nothing left for him to take. Because I'd already made sure there wasn't. Some people see a house and think that's the prize. They see the accounts and the property and the things a man spends 67 years building. And they think those are the things worth having. They don't understand that none of that is the point. The point is the letters in a safe deposit box that a woman wrote with shaking hands so her daughter would have her voice in the hard moments. The point is a girl at a kitchen table, reading in the morning light, with her father making coffee in the next room. That's what I was protecting, and in the end, it was the only thing that was ever really mine to give.